Welcome to Auto Arcadia. I am one of your hosts, Colin Wood, and
Thomas Hope, and I'm going to be making the case for F1 to you, Colin, because I'd be right in saying that you're not really a fan. You've not really watched very much F1. You don't really care.
yeah, that'd be true, man. I mean, the last time I watched a race, Michael Schumacher was racing.
Yeah, okay, that does date it a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I came quite late to an interest in Formula One. Like, I've always been really into cars. I've not really cared about F1 until, I don't know, it was kind of like it was when the new regulations came in 2022, I think, that I started
Right.
to be like I started to like really actually watch it, like, with the subscription to the sports package and stuff. But I had kind of casually been following it a little bit before then because the news of the new car regulations, with the whole idea of them like abandoning quite a lot of the elements that were some of the things I found kind of boring about F1. Well, hopefully abandon some of the elements I found quite boring about F1 and to try and make it a little bit more like competitive on track with some more actual racing. I really like the idea of that, and I kind of started watching a little bit, and then I've watched the last few seasons, and I have enjoyed the last few seasons as well. There's definitely some highs with F1 and some serious lows. Like at its worst, F1 is sensationally boring. Like I've definitely fallen asleep to races before.
Fair enough.
But then again, at its high, it's nail-bitingly tense. It's exciting. It's a spectacle. I mean, they call the F1 kind of traveling thing the circus because it's just loads of folk and chaotic, but also there's quite a lot of like pomp and over-the-topness, especially at some of the circuits. Yeah, so that was a bit of a long, kind of winded introduction to why I started watching F1. Was basically the fact that they promised the racing would get better. And I think in a lot of ways it has got a little bit better. From what I know of the last of the hybrid kind of era, well, we're still in the hybrid era, but like the kind of Mercedes dominance era before the new regulations changed, the cars were so heavily laden with onboard downforce. Like every single part of the top of their body would be dedicated to improving the aerodynamic performance of that car, with like lots and lots of wings and like multiple diffusers and like little winglets on top of wings, because they weren't allowed to use ground effect in their cars. So they had to compensate by putting loads of downforce on top. And it meant that the wake from the cars was so turbulent that you couldn't really follow behind another car for too long, because the air would be hotter and your brakes would overheat or your engine would overheat, and you would lose loads and loads of downforce in the corners because the turbulent air that you were running in just didn't provide you with the same level of downforce as kind of clean air, as they call it, which meant that basically it was just kind of a lot of cars following in like a kind of procession around the racetrack. They call them, sometimes it gets called DRS train, which is where cars basically are all following within 1 second of each other and no one can really overtake.
Yeah. Now, this is not to backtrack a wee bit, right? But you said you really got into it when the regulations changed and they said that the racing would get essentially more exciting or better, right? So,
Yeah.
bearing in mind that this is like you putting the case forward for it, why didn't you like it initially? Like, what was it that put you off of the racing before the regulation change? Because I want to know if we are kind of aligned on our thoughts here.
Yes, well, it's the reasons that I didn't like F1 kind of changed over the years. Like when I was really young, I didn't really want to watch F1 on TV, despite family members being interested in it, because the cars didn't really look like the cars that I knew and saw all the time. They didn't look like real cars. I didn't really have any appreciation for like the technical innovation that goes into them, and
That's
like kind of like
fair, man.
the engineering achievement. I just saw cars that didn't really look like cars that I thought were cool, so I didn't really care about watching them race. And then I got really into like kind of rally, kind of because of that. And rally and F1 are like quite different in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then it just became like this sport that you saw the news of, and it was like Hamilton wins, Hamilton wins, Hamilton wins. And honestly, it's maybe just from my perspective, but it's difficult to get excited about jumping into a sport where there's like one team that's absolutely dominating everything and consistently win.
Yeah. I'll give you that one. That's a fair point, well argued.
So yeah, most recently it just been kind of the era of like there's not that much on track overtaking, and it was like largely an era of Mercedes dominance. It actually started to get better towards the end of just before the regulations, where Red Bull and Verstappen were putting on like a much more robust kind of competition to Hamilton. I mean, Verstappen won the 2021 championship by like I think it was like by half a point or a point or something like that on the final race, which is a controversial incident that, to be honest, I don't really have too much of a. I didn't watch the race. I just know about it, and I don't really have too much of a truck in the game between Verstappen and Hamilton. I don't really care, so I'm not going to go into the controversial event. But basically, it was to do with the way they restarted a race under a safety car that felt a bit disadvantageous to Hamilton, and I think the race director resigned afterwards as well. But like F1, just as a record, F1 is filled with controversial events where like someone at some point has made a decision and then everyone spends years afterwards just ripping them and analyzing that decision.
Okay.
I mean, you know exactly what it's like. You're running something and it's one of those things where like the machine started running, you're on a clock. You need to make a decision now that you need to be able to like kind of stand by and back up, and we go with it. And when people make decisions like that, inevitably you get some of them wrong, or a lot of people think that you get some of them wrong.
Yeah. I mean, because when it's a decision like that, it's very much a 50-50. Here we go. Pick one or the other. But I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that that has led to some absolute belters as far as situations go as well for the sport.
Yeah, F1's definitely had its fair share of embarrassing moments. Quite a lot of F1 is embarrassing. It's such a strange ecosystem now because it's very, very corporate compared to where it initially started, which was not very well. That's actually not true. Where it initially started was quite corporate because it was all the manufacturers' race teams. But as kind of society and business has got more corporate, there was a period where F1 really lagged behind everyone else. They were just like it was more of just like privateer teams that were like a unit and a fabrication shop, and they built a car, or they built a car and then they bought like an engine,
Yeah.
and they glued the two together and they went racing. But now it's very much like big global manufacturers, massive sponsorship, like it's big money. And there's like almost this expectation that everyone should kind of be like a business professional in that environment.
Huh. That's a very, very disappointing way to look at motorsport.
Yes, it is. I'm here to make the case for F1, but I'm not gonna defend it all completely. Like there's a lot that could be changed in F1 to make it a better sport to watch and enjoy. Yeah. So I mean, I think first I might need to ask you, what do you actually know about F1? Like, do you know like what some of the rules mean?
So obviously, starting from the top, I know that it's the pinnacle. It is the absolute bleeding edge of automotive technology. And also quite a lot of innovation that started in Formula One has trickled down to road cars, arguably more so than quite a lot of other forms of motorsport. I briefly know of some of the famous rivalries, like Hunt, for example, which is like when I think of Formula One, that's what I think of is James Hunt, and it's just like playboy, pisshead, rocking up, jumping into a car, racing, job done. You know, that's very much the way I like to think of motorsports and motorsport racers, drivers.
It's really interesting that you brought up that particular time being like what you think of.
Really,
Yes, it's really, really interesting because I think that James Hunt Nicky Lauda rivalry is also it kind of has this kind of flash of Nicky Lauda, like he was like a kind of a professional racing driver. Like he took it really seriously. He put like a lot of effort in. He's a very serious man. He's like a great racer. Wait, actually, I think he passed away. Sorry, he was a great racer. But in comparison, James Hunt, he just like wanted to get in the car and boost about. Like he loved the actual doing the racing part. He didn't really care so much about the car development or kind of that kind of stuff bolted on.
yeah. And I mean, I think that's the thing that put me off of Formula One. and that might need a little bit of definition behind it. So, like, I tend to romanticize cars, motorsport especially. Like, to me, a car always has a personality. It's not just metal, rubber, lump of plastic, you know. In a lot of cases, they are a lot more than the sum of their parts for me. And it's going to be very uncharitable to say this, but Formula One always seemed like a very expensive game of follow the leader. But at the
Yes,
same
I can
time,
see
like,
why you say that.
yeah,
And it's sometimes, kind of hard to argue against that position in some ways.
sorry, man.
No, honestly, like, we need to be fair.
Yeah,
I am trying to convince you that it's worth watching, but we do need to be fair. And, like, yeah, sometimes it can be really processional. And that's affected by a lot of stuff. That's the problem. There's, like, lots of complicated reasons why we are where we are.
yeah. Because I think really the thing I don't get is the act of Formula One. You know, like the actual technology I find fascinating as an engineer. And when you've got a screaming V12, V10, and V6s now, though, isn't it? And just ludicrous levels of power and acceleration, and really it's quite visceral in its like the drivers are arguably at the top of their game as far as fitness is concerned, in the same way that the cars are at the bleeding edge of technology. And it's quite easy to romanticize all that, which makes it seem very me. It's the team orders and that sort of thing that put me off, if that makes sense. Like, it's almost like they want somebody to finish in a certain position for the benefit of a team, and I don't really agree with that.
You would prefer maybe if it was like a kind of solo, like it was like every man for himself, a race, you race with passion to try and like get the best position you can. Whereas because there's two championships, there's the drivers' championship and there's also the constructors. There's a big part of it is, it's actually the team, and if you can do something that, better places the team, we would like you to do that. There's way more money on the line for the constructors. Like, they get a huge prize pool, and it's big increments between the different positions.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, that's why team orders is like, it's unpopular, but I think it's tolerated because people understand that the constructors is really important to the actual teams, even though as fans we might care about like who wins the drivers.
Yeah, so there's almost like the team orders pay for the party almost.
Yeah, a little bit, a little bit. I mean, you could definitely argue that it's a shame that the the kind of pinnacle motorsport is kind of compromised by the fact that it's a team game as well as an individual game. But F1's always been a little bit like that. It's not as much of a kind of like a spec race. That's it.
Yeah.
Like F2, I think is quite heavily restricted. I think it's the same platform everyone gets, and you can just kind of like do a little bit of finessing with some things. Whereas F1's never been like that. It's always been quite heavily like technical innovation led as well. Like, it's bringing the best car is part of the battle in F1, not just being the best driver.
Awesome. No, that I like that idea. Like, the concept is certainly something I can get on board with. I do have a question for you off the back of this though,
Yeah.
and it's directly related to the innovation and like having the best car. I love the saying, if you can't beat them, cheat.
Yes.
Do the teams love that saying as well?
I mean, it's motorsport, so aye, they do. Yeah, I think cheating has got harder
Right.
than it used to be. I think in a lot of ways, but it's it does still occasionally happen. There's a few things that I'll mention in like a kind of brief history. There's been some notable kind of scandals and cheating things, but often because F1 is um, it's a really like kind of it's a really small world, if you know what I mean. Um, and all of the teams are kind of against each other, but they also have to like work together to be like a team association and represent all of their interests and stuff. They have like a kind of weird, uneasy, mistrustful relationship that's quite bureaucratic between each other. So what'll happen is someone will release a technical innovation and immediately all the other teams will protest that it's against the rules.
Right.
And so then there'll be like a review of the rules, and maybe the FIA will step in and they'll issue like a correction, like to like close a loophole, or they'll allow it and they'll say it's okay, and then all of the other teams will quickly develop that system if it proves to be effective, like that kind of technical arms race.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, actually. Like the little, it's like mutually assured destruction in an automotive setting. Well, man, I'm really looking forward to you making the case for this because I've told you this in like previous conversations that I'm actually really looking forward to it, and this is an episode that I have been really amped for since you suggested it. So yeah,
Yeah, I
man.
hope I do this justice, and do jump in if you've got like a question.
Well, I absolutely will.
Because like I found it really interesting. You actually brought up two topics that I intend to cover. In fact, three topics I intend to cover.
Really?
In like why I like it. Yeah, which is really interesting. You brought up the technology from F1 leaking into like new normal cars. Like the different kind of like cheating that may go on. You've talked the rivalries as well as something that I'm gonna cover. Is like I think you're probably interested in similar things to me, to be honest.
Yeah. It doesn't surprise me particularly much that that's the case because I've noticed quite a lot of similarities between us, like between
Yeah.
choices of cars and that sort of ilk when we've been recording. So yeah, I really am looking forward to this. Well, how do you want to start?
Well, I'm going to
What's
give you a little history. I'm going to give you a little history lesson.
Hit me, man. Hit me.
Right. So basically, F1 kind of started in the 1920s with like European racing championships, but it wasn't like particularly structured or anything like that. So what happened is the French FIA, which is, and I'm going to mess this right up, Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, which was established in 1904, they kind of got involved. And in 1946, they kind of created what is now like F1, if you know what I mean. And like at first, it was kind of just like your Italian sports cars that were, and Mercedes that were involved. So like Maserati, Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Mercedes, they were like the big names doing the kind of like largely European races.
Right.
They've always had engine regulations, which is like kind of interesting. And the first cars were 1.5 liter supercharged cars, which is,
Incredible.
quite a strange displacement. And they did some V12s as well. Ferrari has always loved the V12. But yeah, in the early days, it was kind of like a bit rough and ready. And there was like the kind of the biggest driver from the early days would be Fangio.
Okay.
Juan Manuel Fangio. He was kind of prolific. He raced for pretty much every manufacturer as well, and won in like loads of different manufacturers. And there's some great documentaries on him actually, but I'm not going to talk about the older racers too much. I want to focus more on like modern F1 because like we can't go back and watch these races. There's very
Yeah.
very little point in me dwelling on them too
Well,
much.
I do have a question, and I know this is very early days, but I know you said a lot of like Ferrari, Maserati, Alfa Romeo. So like stuff like the Alfa Romeo birdcage, early racers. Would I be right in thinking that we actually owe some of the most beautiful car designs ever made
Yes, no,
to
that's
early
something I
days
didn't
Formula
talk
One?
on. But yeah, those cars were beautiful because that was when it was like mechanical grip, thin, large, like thin tires, large diameter wheels, kind of leaf spring kind of style setups. But the cars were like so beautifully flowing and kind of like aerodynamic. There was that Auto Union car that was like just a top speed kind of car that even had the wheels enclosed and like really smoothed over kind of arches.
Yeah, I'm following you on that. So like your Maserati Tipos, your Alfa Romeo birdcages, your like, P330 Ferraris, that sort of
Yeah,
peak
exactly.
romanticized.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like yeah,
awesome.
yeah, I totally agree. Like really beautiful pieces of machinery and stuff like that. I think kind of really the only notable thing that happens like early on is that unrelated to F1 but kind of relevant. There was a big crash in the 55 Le Mans, and like lots of people died. I think it was like maybe over 100 people died, like
Holy fuck, man.
spectators and stuff. It was a really bad crash, and Mercedes ended up pulling out of motorsport for like the next 40 years.
Really?
Yeah, they just noped right out of all forms of motorsport, including F1. So they disappeared from F1, and then as kind of F1 matured, kind of some smaller, more kind of teams that were designed just to go racing kind of appeared, like Vanwall, which was the British one. And then you kind of have like the drivers like Sterling Moss kind of coming up and stuff like that around like I don't know, around like the late kind of 50s, early 60s. The mid-engined layout started to become kind of like, oh, people kind of cottoned on that that was the layout to use going forward. So
Right.
that kind of pops up there, and then we kind of get to the early 60s, and really that's when things start to get quite interesting, because then Lotus come in, and Lotus had Colin Chapman, who had lots of ideas. I'm not gonna oversell him and be like, oh, he came up with everything. He was like, he was there when stuff like this was being developed. He like did lead a few of the things himself, but also he was like, pushing for constant innovation. Like the 60s was like that time of just massive technical innovation and really big jumps into like new areas like aerodynamics, like downforce, like ground effect, that kind of stuff.
Hmm. So really, like that's this is when it started becoming Formula One, like in layman's terms. Like is this when the cars sort of started adopting that wedge, low slung wing at the front, wing at the back sort of look that's kind of stuck with it to pretty much till today.
Yeah, I would say kind of the late 60s, kind of early 70s is when you'd start to recognize what you would be able to just identify as that's a Formula One car. The big front wing, the big rear wing, the flat kind of cheese wedge shape.
Good stuff. Yeah.
So yeah, the engine regs kind of changed. Lotus came in with some quite interesting developments. One of them was using the motor as being kind of like part of the actual chassis. So like bringing in monocoque design and then having the monocoque only really go to the end of the driver's compartment, and then using the motor as actually kind of part of the overall frame. So
Right.
it was like, yeah, structural, which is, it's quite kind of innovative thinking, which is what I would say really kind of is highlighted in this kind of era.
Definitely, because like as you say that, I'm like, so this is like where stressed member, the sort of idea of stressed member engineering comes in, and one thing that strikes me here is the amount of technology and vehicles that actually owe something to that development alone. Like it transcends cars. Like you're talking motorbikes and commercial vehicles and all sorts at this point, which all lend to that as an update, as a development even, which is really fucking interesting, man.
It is wild how far the reach of some of this stuff has kind of permeated. Um, it's good. It's always kind of really interesting to drive innovation in a particular direction. So yeah, the kind of 70s is when aero starts to like really come in, and there's also like some other kind of key things happen in the 70s, I would say, that really impact on what F1 becomes and is. And I would say the most important thing, beyond downforce, beyond like the actual kind of like widespread implementation of like the thing F1 is kind of known for now, and it would be unlimited sponsorship, like a no cap on how much sponsorship money they could take. And that led to tobacco getting involved. And it
Yeah.
has continued to lead to some very, very interesting sponsors, put it that way, on some F1 teams. Like, parking aside the petroleum giants and stuff like that, like it's F1, I can kind of understand why they would be involved in as a sponsor. But then when you look at things like the crypto exchanges, like there's lots of F1 teams that are sponsored by crypto. And there's also a lot of, I think Ferrari might have been sponsored at one point by Project Winnow. It's like a sustainable arm, I think, of I think it's a tobacco company.
Right.
But yeah, so like F1's always had this kind of like relationship with like sponsors that have big money, but are not necessarily like able to really sponsor that much else easily because of no one else really wants their sponsorship.
Fair enough. That's actually quite interesting that they found somewhere to spend their money. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was an emerging kind of like, it was getting to be quite a big sport. It had like, international coverage on television. Like, people watched F1, and then they started to kind of, as camera technology got better and timing technology, it became like more and more serious, if you know what I mean. And then big tobacco brands started to get involved in sponsoring and spending that cash. And with that cash comes more development, which leads to kind of like faster cars. And that was a big theme. Actually, in fact, I was going to say it was a big theme of that kind of period of F1, but it's been a big theme kind of consistently throughout F1. The FIA come up with some nice regulations for that kind of, series, and then the teams develop a car, and then they make it better, and then they make it better, and then they make it better to the point where it gets a bit too fast, and then the FIA are like, "Now we're going to change the regulations, bring everyone back down a little bit, slow the pace down, make it a bit safer," and then the cycle just continues. There's always one or two innovations in a cycle that basically break the original kind of confines of what they were. Oh, we're hoping to keep them under a certain speed or under a certain number of G's around corners. There's always an innovation that comes along and just completely ruins that, and then they have to start again and redo the regs.
I really like that. That it's just constant. Like the fact that you've got a regulatory body that has to actually fight and batter back engineers, like basically beating them off with a shitty stick, saying, "No, you're going too fast. No, you're going round the corner too quickly." That's just class, man.
An astonishing amount of that in F1, considering it's meant to be like the fastest cars can go, and they're like, "Nah, you're just going around corners too fast. Calm it down." Yeah, so like the 70s had some really, really interesting innovations. Like, I'm sure you've seen pictures of old Can-Am racers with like the giant wings, like really high up.
Yes, like
But
the chaparral and stuff like that.
yeah, totally. That was also kind of run in F1 as well in like the very early stages of wings. But basically, what would happen is they would be loaded and the struts could become damaged and just kind of like have a wing just kind of flying randomly off. So the FIA came down on that one and were like, nope, you can have wings, but they have to be like actually fixed to like the chassis. They can't just be like they can't be like a meter and a half above your car because that's where the clean air is. No, they have to be close, which I really like because there is maybe a world where that didn't happen and all of our F1 cars just have wings really, really high up to avoid like interacting with the dirty air from the cars in front. I would really like that.
Yeah, I
Like
mean that
absolutely ridiculous.
you just kind of in an arms race for who can have the tallest spoiler at that point.
Yeah, tallest and widest spoiler. I think the other kind of probably quite interesting car of that time would be Lotus's experimental gas turbine car with four-wheel drive, but I'm not even sure if that ever saw a race.
Oh, that is quite disappointing.
Yeah, I mean that was then I think it was like around 75 or something like that. Ferrari introduced the kind of, well, they started mounting their gearbox transversely to get a little bit better weight distribution in the car, like a little bit more weight towards the kind of center back, which is kind of like, another one of those developments that's come a little bit more standard, if you know what I mean, like that really took off.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I am a bit bowled over by how much is actually owed by this sport to Lotus.
Yeah, Lotus were really involved in the 70s, like really, really involved, but they kind of petered out because it's an expensive sport and, when you're not getting the returns on the racetrack, it's quite easy to bow out. And that's a really common story in F1 as well, is, like you have like a team will come along filled with ambition, they'll maybe make it one or two seasons and then they'll disappear because they can't keep up the pace. They can't develop like the likes of Mercedes or Ferrari. They just don't have the facilities,
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
is sad.
you're very much at the mercy of your bank balance, really.
Completely, and your sponsorship balance, like fundamentally. I mean, that's actually a big deal in the sport still. The idea of a paid driver, someone who brings so much sponsorship money to the team that he can buy a drive.
Yeah, and I mean the big thing with that is as well, like the unseen side effect of that is you have a couple of bad races and then suddenly your sponsorship can vanish. So like, yeah, I mean it seems like a very fickle thing.
Yes, it can be a very fickle place because drivers have contracts, but there's always a buyout clause. There's always some way through some X amount of money that they can replace you. And there's been some right fuck ups with driver contracts, I can absolutely tell you. Like recently, a young driver has come into F1 called Oscar Piastri. He's an Australian.
Right.
He drives for McLaren at the moment, has done for the last couple of years, and he's really good. He's a fantastic driver. He's young, he's quick, and I suspect he's probably got like a long and strong career in F1. He could potentially win a championship with the right kind of car. But he was an Alpine junior, and he spent his entire time in like the Alpine Formula, kind of junior Formula program,
Right.
but they basically left him on the fence after having like one F2 and you can't, do it again and stuff like that. Like they left him on the fence for so long that his agent was like, nah, 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 and negotiated a deal with McLaren to get him signed. But Alpine just kind of expected him to want to sign for them. So around the same time they became ready to like promote him to F1, they announced it on Twitter that like he would be driving for them next year, and he had to like respond and be like, "I will not be driving for you next year. I'll be driving for McLaren."
Wow.
Yeah, they basically spent all this money and time nurturing this like really good talent for the next generation of F1 driver, and then just like totally and utterly dropped the ball in it, completely and utterly dropped the ball, and now he's doing really really well in McLaren. Like he's had a win. He's had his actual first ever Formula One Grand Prix win already.
Wow.
Yeah. But to be fair, he probably dodged a bullet because the Alpine car has been absolute dog shit for the last couple of years. Like Alpine are essentially Renault, and
Right.
Renault have this amazing habit in F1 to be like, we're in F1. Ah, we're doing shit. We're leaving F1. We're back in F1. Ah, we're leaving F1. We're back. So they've done this a fair few times. They love the idea of Renault winning, but they don't really want to. They don't understand that can take like years to come in and actually be like a constructor's title winning team. You need
Right.
to really develop and understand what's going on in your car. You can't just like rock up and be quick anymore. Maybe back in the day, you could actually just like develop a good car, have a shit hot fast driver, and actually win a couple of races. But now it's not like that.
Right. You've got almost like a skill barrier that you have to like. Not a skill barrier is the wrong word. It's like it's a learning curve even if you know what you're doing, and it is monumentally steep sort of thing. Like you can't just walk up and expect to ace it.
Not as a team. Definitely not as a team. Like there's again, the history of F1 is littered with stories of teams that basically there's a team, the Jaguar team, I think, competed in like one season, and I don't think they competed under their name. I'm not 100% sure on that. The Jaguar team became Red Bull. They were bought by Red Bull. But even before that, the Jag team was I think it was a previous Ford team. So like basically F1 teams kind of just get recycled and repackaged into like a new team, and a team comes over and the name changes. So they never really die, if you know what I mean. They're always like it's the same facility, they just change the branding.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes sense because like if you have a team and it goes defunct, it's still there. Like
Yep.
all those people that were employed by that team still exist, and all that equipment and data, hardware, everything there. It's all.
It's like a viable project that just needs money put into it is often the case.
Yeah, it's like you've got it's all an asset, and that asset, like you're not going to scrap it, you're going to move it around, and you're just going to recycle it where and when you have to, I suppose.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I watched the Braun GP documentary, the one that Keanu Reeves did for Disney, which is a strange sentence to say about like fairly small F1 team. But that's a really, really interesting documentary about a guy called, I think it's Ross Braun. I should really know that. Who was involved in F1 for a really long time, and I actually just managed to put together, kind of the right money men to buy a team that was kind of there but didn't have anyone.
Right.
Oh no, was that when Toyota came in and then left, and Ross brought they spent so much money. Toyota came in to so many manufacturers think they can just come into F1 and immediately do well. So they came in, they spent some time developing their first year's car. It did quite badly, but during that time they were developing the car for the second year, and they'd learned like a lot, and the second one was going to be a lot more, convincing. But they pulled out. Toyota pulled out and ceased all kind of motorsport activities and stuff like that before the second season kind of started. So Braun came in and was like, literally everything's good to go. We just need someone to fund it, put it together, and made Braun GP. And it's just an interesting story. They basically had no money, but they had a really quick car because of all of the Toyota development. So
Right.
yeah, that's a really interesting documentary as well, actually.
Braun.
Yeah, Braun
Right.
GP, I think it was called.
I think I remember the Braun cars because they were black and silver.
It could be. I remember them being white.
I might be getting mixed up because I seem to remember them being on the telly around the same time as Schumacher.
Yeah, they probably would have been around that era, yeah.
Sorry, I'm sidetracking you again. Please do continue. I'm absolutely loving this, man.
Just thinking about other stuff that you might kind of find interesting that's happened in the past. One thing I would say, which is kind of worth looking at if you have the time and the inclination and you like the older style F1, F1 TV has a very cheap UK subscription because you can't watch live F1 in the UK on F1 TV because Sky owns the license for broadcasting it. But
Right.
in compensation, they have all of the archived F1 races, and they have pretty good coverage for more modern races. But they even have some archived of 60s races, 70s races, and some of them are really, really good to watch. And you get to see some of these mental cars that they run in action as well, like the Tyrrell six-wheeler. Have you ever seen a picture of that?
Yes, I have, and it
Of
looks
course you have, yeah.
so crazy.
It's mental that that thing didn't just race. It actually did all right. It won a race.
Right. Really?
Yeah, absolutely crazy. It won a race. I can't remember which one it was, but it did win a race. And I can't believe they let it run for a season as well. I think they let it run for two, and it just wasn't very quick the second time out. Because usually any kind of change to a typical car layout, and teams are protest, illegal, against the rules.
Yeah. It kind of is a shame that because I'd really like to see what happens when you really do the 70s. Obviously, the engineers were on a bit of a happiness bent, and they were just going mental. And I mean, let's make a Formula One car with six wheels. No, let's make a Formula One car with a gas turbine engine and four-wheel drive. This is what I want. It
Yeah,
should be unhinged and mental at the top.
it was a little bit more of the Wild West. And they were still racing these kind of quite snappy, twitchy kind of race cars in crazy conditions. One of the big rivalries at that period was as we talked about, Lauda and Hunt.
Yeah.
And Nicky Lauda had that massive crash at the Nürburgring. It left him out of a lot of the season and really badly burnt, all over his face because his car caught fire. And that's kind of when F1 got its kind of one of its first kind of safety shake-ups, safety wake-up calls, because the drivers start to put their foot down and say we're not racing in these really shit conditions. It's just not safe. We basically potter around the course really, really slowly, and then every so often just spin because you can't anticipate where there's going to be grip in these conditions. Yeah, so that's kind of one of the first ones. Not a great deal of stuff kind of really happens off the back of that. I'm pretty sure they still kind of don't. Nothing material kind of happens after that, I don't think.
Yeah. I suppose the first big safety event's something quite material. And I know a bit about that, and it's solely due to the film. all,
Oh,
all about Lauda and Hunt.
yeah, that's a
Um,
fun film actually.
it's really well done, man. And
Yeah, it feels like the racing feels kind of fast and exciting, which I really appreciate.
yeah, it was clearly done by somebody who actually wanted to do so. Because it's very easy for motorsport films to be very dry.
Oh yeah,
but that is actually an enthralling watch, and I really enjoyed it. And it's part of what kind of draws me to that era as well, because it's easily
Yes,
romanticized. Again,
it's quite glamorous, really, isn't it?
it is. I mean, when he's falling out of his private plane with a whiskey in hand and a supermodel in the other, like chain smoking, and then going in and talking to big man at McLaren, going, "Oh, aye, well, I'm just going to go and party." So it's like class, cool. No, that's awesome. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that glamour F1 likes to think it still has, but it's kind of been lost, you know? It's F1's had to grow up a little bit with, the rest of the times.
yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, and I have to disagree wholeheartedly because, see, not long after the first time I watched Hunt versus Lauda, there was an image of, oh, what's the British driver that I hate? Hamilton, that's him. I can't even remember his name. And he was like going down the pit road with like an Audi on in bright pink with like fashion sunglasses on and like on a little electric scooter. And it's like, how did we go from having drivers like Lauda and Hunt, who admittedly were very different people, but absolute badasses, to this?
I mean, I totally disagree. Like, I think F1 needed to mature. Like, you can't still act like it's the 70s. The 70s were maybe a great time for some people, but not for a lot of other people. And it's like kind of denial, like just trying to kind of live out that glamour. Like, I feel some of like F1's kind of pomp in a lot of its places does try and recapture a little bit of that glamour, but it's kind of not acknowledging that maybe that time's a little bit past. Why do you dislike Hamilton? Because I have no like I'm kind of ambivalent to Hamilton versus Max, but I actually do quite like Lewis Hamilton. I think one of the things he has done for the sport, which is really really good, is he's made it a little bit more diverse, and he's really pushed for it to be like, kind of like more inclusive, and he's kind of pushed back against some of the kind of like it's F1's so dirty because it's like it works with a lot of like the like Saudi Arabia and stuff like that. Like these
Yeah,
countries where they host Grand Prix in countries that have like awful record of like human rights abuses and stuff like that. So like it's kind of dirtied by that a little bit, and like Hamilton's done a fair bit of kind of speaking up against that, which is like from what I've seen from like reading like kind of fan kind of forums and stuff like that, is the general consensus with fans as well, is they're not really that keen on a lot of F1 races being in like sketchy countries with like shady histories of abuse and stuff.
that's fair. Like, I mean, it's really a bit of an embarrassment that a top flight sport is entertaining places like that. But then it's the same for everything because they've got big money, they get
It,
away with it.
you're
So
right on the money.
I
It's all about the money.
I absolutely wouldn't judge Formula One for that because, well, I mean, outside of Yas Marina being a horrible track for me personally, like I just don't like the idea of it. It's all very flat. There's no elevation change, and it's basically just there for Playboy millionaires to park their yacht up at and watch the race. That's the whole reason it exists.
Yeah, I don't like
Um,
Yas Marina either. I completely agree. It's so flat. It's so flat and angular, and it's just a bit boring.
Yeah, like it doesn't do it for me. Like if then you've got something like Spa, where that's like, oh my God, what a track. Like,
Yeah.
and it's in Belgium, so you can have chocolate and drink nice beer while you're there. An amazing track with big elevation changes and amazing corners that's steeped, absolutely dripping in history and tradition. And then you go to Abu Dhabi for Yas Marina, and it's just like it's a dry country. I can't have a drink. There's so many issues socially that it's just pretty horrible place. It's really hot. It's a dry heat, and I'm too skint to actually do anything here.
I mean, you need to afford the tickets for the F1 in the first place, which is another problem with F1. The ticket prices are absolutely mental.
Yeah, although I have to say on this one, there was a package deal popped up on my Facebook today and it was 3 nights from a credible company as well. It wasn't like they've been doing like a lot of deals on holidays to Japan and stuff, a lot of motorsport holidays as well, and they were doing the full 3-day ticket to Spa with transfers and everything else for 1,500 quid a person, including your hotels.
Was that including the tickets, like the 3-day pass to the spa
Yep.
too?
Yeah, that was including the tickets to get into Spa and sit in the stands and stuff. So like that was including your race day ticket. So you'd have 3 days at the races, and there was like a day in Bruges and a day in, oh, what's the other place called? It's right by the water. It's not Ghent. It's the other one. But anyway, yeah. So it was like fly you into Charleroi, drive you up, or put you on the train to get up there, then from Bruges to Spa, 3 days at Spa with a 4-star hotel, and then back to the airport and fly you back for 1,500 quid a person, which I thought was pretty reasonable.
I don't even know how to judge that. Like it's not an insane amount of money, but also it's quite a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean it's 500 quid a day, which is a lot.
Yeah.
But it's not like you don't have to be a millionaire to afford that. Like a working man who's reasonably well together could afford that.
Yeah, as a little treat, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not something you couldn't go to every race.
No, definitely not. Sorry, no, I've digressed us quite far off what you said. So the reason I don't like Hamilton, right, is basically because it's Hamilton. As a person, I don't think he's someone I would gel with personally. Like I could never see myself going to the pub with Hamilton for a pint. Like, and although I've never
Yeah, I
met
can
the
see what
guy,
you mean. I don't think I would ever go to the pub for a pint
like,
either, but like I think I admire like what he's done and really respect like, the effort he's put in and stuff like that.
fair enough. Yeah, I'll give you that. But I mean, the one standout for me was like Mercedes when he started and he was on Top Gear and he was getting interviews everywhere and he's like, oh yeah, having this interview, and he's like, Clarkson's like, so what car did you get? Because Mercedes would have gave you a car. He goes, yeah, I got a diesel 4x4. Like, me and you are not the same people, my friend. Like that's a absolute embarrassment.
I mean, fair enough. I always felt bad for the F1 drivers when Renault was competing because they only got Renaults, so they would just get like a hot Megane.
Yeah, but I mean, let me put it to you this way: would you rather have like an RS 260 Megane, or would you have a diesel 4x4 Merc?
Oh, I'm having the Megane, like, oh, most certainly. I mean, yeah.
But yeah, no, sorry, man. That's my reasoning. Like, there's nothing wrong with him as what he is and what he does. Like, admittedly, he's a very talented driver. I
He
just
is,
am
yeah.
a fan of him. Like,
Fair enough, like totally fair enough. That's the kind of weird thing about like watching something like F1. You end up liking drivers for reasons that you can't really place,
yeah,
and disliking them for kind of similar reasons. Like I'm just not really a big fan of Sergio Perez, who's like a current driver. I've never really rated him. I've never really thought he's been that good. But like, it's not like because he's not doing well is the reason I don't like him. Like I like lots of drivers that don't really do very well. But there's something about him I just don't find him very interesting. Whereas quite I kind of like most of the F1 drivers on the current grid. They generally seem kind of sound and they've got like something interesting about them.
yeah. It's like certainly there's a lot more to this than I thought there would be, and it's actually quite surprising as you're going through the history of it, how much I'm gelling with as well.
What do you mean?
Like, there's a lot of it that really appeals to me on numerous levels, and there's a lot of it that I'm finding quite interesting. Like
I
the
think you'd
fact
really
that,
get a lot out of watching the older races, like the actual like the 70s races. You'd probably
yeah,
quite enjoy. The only thing is, not all of them are that interesting all of the time, if you know what I mean. So a bit of like Googling. There's a website where fans have like rated all of their favorite races, and you can probably filter that by season, so you can find out. And the race usually has like a quick synopsis of like what happens. So you can like click on a race and be like, oh, this one's really good because like it rained at the start and then there was a couple of spins and there was a bit of crashing and then it dried off and it was all about who put the right tires on at the right time, and there's like a mad charge right at the end, someone coming up from like 4th place to try and take the win. So it's like a total nail biting finish. As opposed to one where it's like, yeah, qualified on pole, started in the lead, led the first lap, won the race by 10 seconds. That's
Yeah.
not always the most interesting race. Like, I think that's the reason why a lot of the Mercedes dominance was so boring. It's like sometimes Hamilton would be like over a minute ahead of the second place. It's like that's not that much fun, really, is it?
No, I mean it might as well just not even have been in the same race at a
He
minute.
didn't finish in the same race.
I mean, my idea of like motorsport, certainly the rallying sphere, is that tenths and hundredths of a second can make or break a race. And there's a guy finishing in like a modern day top flight motorsport with a minute between him and second place.
Yeah. Yeah, it needed to change. It really did need to change. Glad they fixed that. The races have been a lot closer and a lot more competitive. Like Max Verstappen's dominance last season, notwithstanding, in which he was properly winning races by 40-second margins. Like the car was quick. He was quick. No one could touch him. I think he won something like 95% of all of the races. Or maybe
Wow.
no, 95% of all the races were won by a Red Bull, and Verstappen won the majority of them.
Right.
Absolutely insane. Like the last season of F1 was boring as fuck because it was Red Bull. It was Red Bull. It was Red Bull. It only really got a bit interesting towards the end when, or was it last season or was it the season before? I can't remember. One of the last 2 seasons, but they only got interesting towards the end when McLaren started to develop a car that could kind of start to challenge the Red Bull a little bit.
Right.
So there was like kind of closer fighting for the lead of a race. But by that time, the championships, like the drivers and constructors championship, were long sewn up. There was no mystery left in it.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I get that because like it is what you're describing does sound absolutely watching paint dry. Just
Yes.
one man at the front smacking everybody about. It's like it's not much fun.
Do you know what I hate to say? But if I was ever to recommend watching F1 to someone, I would suggest that they make it like a housework watch, or if you've like got a couple of monitors and you like have like a kind of game you can play in the background or something, because it's not something that you're really necessarily going to be glued to 100% of the time.
Yeah.
But it's also something that spontaneously can get really compelling, so you want to be like aware of it. You don't want to be relying on like kind of watching like highlights or hearing the news, online kind of like secondhand. Or at least maybe that's just me. I do kind of like to be watching along live. I like to follow it as it's happening.
Fair enough, man. Fair enough.
But I'm pretty much always playing a game and alongside watching the F1. Okay, so picking off at kind of like the late 70s, that's when you kind of start seeing ground effect being introduced again by Lotus. Renault kind of started joined in with F1 and they brought Michelin in, but then Michelin then left a little bit later because originally there was no restriction on tires in F1. Like you could negotiate with a manufacturer to develop you an F1 tire. So like different kind of brands have done it over the different years. Like at the moment it's Pirelli, but at the moment you're not allowed to pick your tire brand. It's just like there is a tire supplier for F1 and everyone gets the same tires.
Right.
For reasons which I'll talk about later, is maybe one of the reasons that fed into this, as well as the 05 US Grand Prix, which was a strange race.
I'm looking forward to this one.
But basically, yeah, ground effects kind of first introduced. It proves to be like incredibly successful. Everyone absolutely loves it. Kind of around this time, turbochargers are starting to get a bit involved. It kind of became like a little bit of a battle between the turbocharged engines, which couldn't really run as much kind of ground effect because of the turbo layout, like all the piping that needed to go with it and the cooling and stuff.
Right.
Against the V8 kind of Ford Cosworth V8s, that were like down on power but could have a much more effective ground effect setup. So they were a better handling racer versus the kind of power racers. And we kind of see turbocharged cars starting to kind of make their mark on F1 a little bit. And yeah, they'll return a little bit later as well with a vengeance. the kind of late 70s, early 80s was kind of when a lot more kind of private teams got involved as well with F1. There's been a lot. I can't even begin to list how many there's been. A lot of British ones. The UK loves entering motorsport with pretty much no money and trying to make it work. And then basically it got to the point where everyone worked out that turbocharging was the way to go. So then we get into like the kind of the 1.5 turbos that were just insane engineering. Like with the kind of high performance fuel in their like qualifying spec, some of these motors were kicking out like like 1,350 horsepower.
Fucking hell.
And they were revving to like, like 18,000 RPM. Like these things were like kind of you got the motor and it would last an amount of time, and how hard you pushed it and how much like volatile bang bang juice you threw at it would dictate how long that would last.
Fair enough. Yeah, this is like when the budgets must have ballooned then.
I think so. I think so. I mean, this is still not getting to the insane levels of money, but things are getting more serious, and also with the turbochargers and stuff like that, things are getting faster, like really fucking quick. And now F1 has always had this like history of people dying on track. Like loads of drivers up until this point have died. It's been like an ongoing issue, but there hadn't really been too many bad ones for a bit. But then turbochargers started making cars fast, and people start having big accidents and dying, which is kind of like obviously not the best for your
Yeah,
motorsport championship.
it's not great.
It's not great. So they did do some restricting on like the fuel rate you could feed into the engine and like kind of turbo pressure to try and bring down the power. But cars were like F1 cars were starting to get like properly fast, and not just like fast in a straight line, but like continuously fast round corners and things like that. And probably, as we both know, going fast in a straight line isn't really necessarily that dangerous. It's when you try and go fast around corners and the unpredictability that brings in, that's when things start to get a bit spicy in the safety department.
Yeah, it's when the wibbly wobbly shit starts that the
Yeah,
men and
yeah.
the boys are sorted.
When sideways physics interacts with forwards and back physics, things get bad.
Yeah.
That is an approved engineering description of of the issue as well. So yeah, so basically we're in like that kind of turbocharged era. There was very briefly the Brabham fan car, which was kind of like the Chaparral 2J that used like a fan to kind of suck the car down onto the ground to create like a kind of ultra high downforce vehicle, which it did actually get to win. It got to enter a race, which it won, and then it was immediately banned because like it was just I don't think they could have continued it with everyone using like a suction car, because they would have just been everyone would have been flat out almost everywhere.
Yeah, fair enough.
And also around this time, yeah, we're starting to see the introduction of like people starting to think about stuff like carbon fiber. That was, I think, a McLaren thing that originally came in.
Right. So that's a big thing. Composite use in motorsport was a
Yeah.
big, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it is all they do now. It's like everything is like a bespoke kind of composite material part, pretty much. So as all good things have to come to an end, turbochargers got banned, and they got banned in '89 going forward. So we jumped back to a higher displacement engine. So now they were allowed 3.5 liters, and that's when V10s and V12 started to kind of crop up. I think V10s were like the most popular kind of engine configuration for that displacement, which is really nice because like the V10s do sound really, really good.
Yeah, this is like peak audio Formula One levels now. This is when it sounded magical.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this is the nice noises from F1. And that lasted for a little bit. There was some kind of other stuff they like brought in around the kind of early 90s and stuff, which is like active suspension. They were kind of allowed a bit more of that, some traction control, and like kind of semi-auto gearboxes, like sequential ones and stuff.
Right.
But then the FIA did a classic FIA, and then they banned driving aids, so they banned like traction control and launch control and stuff. But the problem is that now F1 was starting to move into like that digital kind of, that kind of digital side of things,
Yeah.
which having been like this really mechanical kind of like, it either mechanically is in the rules or it mechanically isn't. Now we're looking at like, oh, how do you tell if a car's ECU's got all of these stability control things installed in it? Like, what do you do? How do you detect that under scrutineering?
Yeah, that's a fair shout. Like, I mean, it's kind of hard to police when you're a mechanical watch and everybody's using digital timers.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. And then as well, this is kind of like, again, another kind of jump up in camera kind of technology around this time. So like cameras are now smaller, so we're starting to get them mounted on the cars. So you're getting like a driver's kind of perspective, or like maybe like an over the shoulder kind of perspective from the driver over the back of the head, which is great because like that's when, I always like to see what's going on from the driver's perspective. I always think that's like the best view in F1.
Yeah. Hmm.
So yeah, then I would say maybe the next big thing that happens to F1 is in '94, Senna and another driver, Ratzenberger, die. And that's like another properly big safety kind of review. There's like a restriction on the cars again on like airflow that can go in to kind of reduce their power output and bring the speed down again. And then they were basically like, nope, we're going to introduce new rules for '95 that's going to address like basically the safety crisis in F1.
Right.
So big change. The cars are now going to be like a kind of standard template, and there's going to be like quite strict design criteria on minimum, maximum, like wing size and stuff like that. This is like really when the technical regs got like very, very prescriptive, and they really tried to like limit as much kind of innovation the teams could do as possible. But they also mandated that the cars be like a certain size, so they had like larger cockpits, kind of a narrower bodywork, so they couldn't have as many like they couldn't have easily have as many radiators on the bodywork. They wanted a wider cockpit so the drivers could get in and out more easily in like terms of an accident. They mandated grooved tires, which totally fucking ruined the kind of racing, in my opinion, because the groove tires just didn't have nearly as much grip. And also you weren't, I don't think, allowed to change tires in a race, so you had to make one set of tires last the whole race. So
Huh.
it was like designing an F1 car and being like, what tires should we put on that? And you're like, the eco long lives, because we want to get to the end of the race. Whereas before you would just be like, we'll just chuck on, like a set of slicks and we'll run them until we need to put on another set of slicks.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like there was a lot of changes made, and it makes sense off the back of the Senna Ratzenberger.
Yeah, it was a big accident. Like, I was going to say another driver actually was injured the same day as well. I think it was Massa.
Right. 'Cause I mean, it's basically like every single change there, like larger cockpits is safety, grooved tires, raising ride height, narrower bodywork, less radiators, reduction in engine size. It's like that's all to curb the speed, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Does kind of defeat the purpose of F1 a little bit when you kind of, if you think about it from that perspective, like you're like, it does feel like a little bit of a step back.
Yeah.
And this is the time of Schumacher as well. So like this is where Schumacher kind of appears and basically wins loads of stuff. Schumacher's quite an interesting driver. There's like a good documentary about. There's actually a couple of good documentaries about him, but he was like very keen on winning. Is one thing I'd say about Schumacher. Like really keen on winning, and he did get a little bit elbows out in some cases. Like he deliberately drove into a driver to take him out of the race. I think a couple of times. Like he was I win or I win or we both lose kind of racer.
Yeah. And I kind of appreciate that. Like this is the sort of racing I think you should have. Like your drivers should be selfish. They should be wanting to like absolutely push it to the total maximum, absolute right to the limit. And then when we get to the limit, we're going to take another couple of steps and just skirt by on luck for a little bit. Like
Yeah.
that is absolutely what I want to see in top flight motorsport, you know?
I do. It's kind of more engaging. It's more like passionate and I don't know, visceral maybe when it's like people are properly pushing on the edge and stuff. Sometimes Formula One can feel like teams are driving well within a comfortable limit to like manage tires and like because it's overall been calculated to set a set pace and use two sets of tires rather than go as fast as you can and use three. And it
Yeah,
makes sense when you think about it from a race point of view. But sometimes when you're watching the cars trundle round at like a set designated pace, you can think, what am I doing? Why am I watching this? Like what's the point? There's no actual racing going on. People are just kind of
yeah,
cutting about. Which yeah, I totally appreciate that. Is like something that F1 really needs to address. I think they've been trying to address it, but it can be quite boring. But one of the things that didn't happen that was boring around this time was the Spygate scandal,
Ooh,
which
do tell me more.
right, so this happened in 2007. So it's actually fairly contemporary. It's not super recent, but it's recent enough. You know, like we existed in 2007.
Yeah.
Like so did the internet and phones and stuff. But basically what happened is through kind of contacts, like kind of known relationships, McLaren got hold of like basically all the technical design documentation for Ferrari's 2007 F1 car.
Now, I'm not an expert, but that sounds a bit naughty.
Yeah, that is actually against the rules. There probably is there's probably quite an expressly written rule about not doing this. So they got a hold of the documentation, and it was like left with one of the kind of like engineering, like mechanical engineers, like one of the development engineers at McLaren, and he needed to make a copy of this some 700-page document. So he asked his wife to go and like go out and get a copy, and she went to just your local print shop. Why wouldn't you? In Woking, Surrey, and asked like to get a copy made. And the guy behind the the working there just happened to be an F1 fan, and on top of that, he happened to be a Ferrari F1 fan. So when he
Right.
was like looking at the documents that he was copying, he was like, "Huh, this doesn't seem right. There's something a bit sus about this. Like, there's quite a lot of like, Ferrari official headers and stuff like that, and it appears to relate to the design of an F1 car." So he contacted Ferrari HQ and was like, I found this. It seems bad. And yeah, like it kind of went from there. It ended up in the Italian courts, the British courts. The Originally, what happened is the McLaren boss, Ron Dennis, who was a really colourful character in F1. He was hauled in front of like the FIA to kind of like explain himself and like what's going on. And the FIA didn't actually have any evidence that anyone at McLaren had seen the documentation. Like it had been taken from Ferrari by someone and it had been handed to this one guy at McLaren, but they couldn't prove the rest of the team had like seen it, that like it had been used in any way. So they couldn't they got off. McLaren got off with it, and
Right.
then what happened is the relationship between Ron Dennis and Fernando Alonso kind of broke down. And Fernando Alonso was one of McLaren's drivers, along with Lewis Hamilton at the time. And basically, Fernando Alonso was like a two-time world champion at that point. He was like the number one driver, but also like Lewis was kind of like
The up
he
and
was like
comer.
the future of McLaren. And I think him and Alonso, like they had a rivalry. Like they did not get on, if you know what I mean. They like constantly disobeyed team orders to like overtake each other or prevent each other from overtaking. Like what happened that kind of really fucked Ron Dennis off is Fernando Alonso waited at the end of the pit lane during qualifying for so long that Lewis Hamilton, his teammate behind him, couldn't reach the line in time to start another flying lap because if you cross the line before the timer hits zero, you still get to complete that lap in qualifying, and a lot of people wait until the last lap because that's when the track's like up to its highest temperature. It's in like peak conditions to get the fastest lap.
Right.
Um, so yeah, they were waiting on that, and Fernando basically just blocked him and prevented Lewis from being able to kind of do his fast qualifying lap, totally humping his qualifying and his race the next time. And Ron Dennis was, as you kind of understand, a bit fucked off by that because like one of his drivers has just ruined his other driver's race because they don't get on. So their relationship had kind of like broken down a little bit. So one of the things Alonso did is he messaged the president of the FIA, Max Mosley, and said, yeah, no, McLaren definitely saw those documents. The team definitely saw those documents. I can provide a statement for that, basically. So yeah, Ron Dennis, McLaren hauled back in front of the FIA. This time, smack guilty. Their 2007 championship stripped away, and they were fined $100 million, which is the largest fine ever given in a sport for a sport. Like, it's just insane. They never paid the 100 million, as you would expect, because, like, McLaren didn't have that kind of money at all. But I think the fine ended up being something like $30 million, which is still a massive, insane fine.
That's mental. I mean, I suppose
Yes.
that's kind of what you get, though, because you were messing with the darling of the sport when you fucked over Ferrari, I suppose. But yeah.
Oh, yeah, most certainly, yeah. Ferrari and the FIA have always had quite a cozy relationship, There was another time, just to get slightly distracted from this scandal, there was another incident where in 2005, at the American Grand Prix, it was held at Indianapolis. And you know what Indianapolis is like? They've got the infield racetrack, but they've also got the speedway.
Yeah.
And the racetrack, the infield speedway, racetrack does use some of the speedway circuit. So in 2005, there's two brands of tire on the grid. There's Michelin and there's Bridgestone. Three teams are running Bridgestone: Ferrari, Minardi, and Jordan. And all the other teams are running Michelin. Turns out, during qualifying, the Michelin tires not really very suited for going around the banked corner at high speed. They got a little bit blowy uppy, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
And this was big problem. Big problem. They had their Michelin tire specialist there at the time, and he's like, honestly, if you guys want to go flat out around this corner, these tires will last 10 laps, which is a bit of an issue when the race is 73 laps and you're not allowed to change the tires. You could kind of see the problem that was brewing there. So the teams went to the FIA, Max Mosley again, and were like, well, can we put like a chicane on the fastest corner just to bring the speed down a little bit, just to slow it down? And he was like, no, you may not. It's unfair to the other teams. It's unfair to the children who did do their homework. You cannot. So what happened in the end was all of the teams running Michelin tires protested and retired from the race. They did the parade, the warm-up lap, and instead of taking their grid positions, they all filed into the pits, which meant there was only 6 cars on the grid, just kind of dotted about, and only 6 cars raced.
Oh, okay.
What an insane, kind of F1's kind of filled with these insanely stupid incidents that kind of happen, along with loads of death and stuff. But yeah, that's a particularly silly one. Max Mosley is he was FIA president for 4 terms. It was something like 93 to 2009, a really long time. And during that time, he actually did do a lot of what we were talking about right at the start, which was drive F1 towards more innovation for the road. So he's responsible for kind of encouraging F1. Well, he's one of the people responsible for encouraging F1 to adopt the kinetic energy recovery system, CARES, hybrid, pushing for the adoption of a hybrid kind of system in F1, and making a lot of the F1 developments a lot more kind of road car applicable. But also he's kind of involved in stuff like grooved tires and raising the ride height and kind of gimping the F1 cars a little bit. So there swings and roundabouts on this one a little bit. I think probably the only other thing you would need to know about F1 is, because Mercedes were super dominant, and we're 1.6 litre V6 hybrids now, is that kind of the man you want, your kind of present day kind of Colin Chapman, your innovator, is a guy called Adrian Newey, and he's a very, very successful Formula One car designer, because he's largely he's almost like an aerodynamics man, as specialist, and he's kind of the one that really pushed a lot of aerodynamic innovation in the kind of last 20 or so years. I would say would be quite a lot down to him. he joins Red Bull, and Red Bull start having like really innovative designs. He was behind the really dominant Williams car from the 80s that Nigel Mansell drove. He was behind, and he was behind the dominant Red Bull as well. I can't remember if he designed the McLaren that was really dominant. He might have. But basically, he's your man when it comes to F1 car design. He's really good at interpreting the rules as well. So like quite a lot of stuff like the double diffuser innovation, I think, was his. And it was kind of a creative interpretation of what a particular distance away from another particular distance can actually mean. Like there can be multiple ways of interpreting what is a fairly basic sentence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of like how far can you push this basic interpretation of the rules?
Yeah, like how, like, okay, what other ways could you understand these words? What other things could you understand these words to mean? Like, what could this word mean? Not what does it mean, what could it mean?
Fair enough, yeah.
And that kind of takes us to the present day on a little history of F1. Like, I mean, at the moment, there's not been that much change from the V6 hybrids. There's more ethanol in the fuel now. The new regs they're going to introduce in 2026, they're decreasing the combustion engine power and they're increasing the battery power, which is quite an
Yeah.
interesting thing they're doing. And
Oh,
I think they're starting to introduce a new kind of like form of DRS. So I don't know if you know what DRS is.
drag reduction.
Yeah, it's the drag reduction system. And do you know why they introduced that in F1?
Was it not to gain more speed? Because you get to a point when you add so much aero that eventually there's so much drag you can't actually do anything
Yeah, it is to
in a
gain
straight
more
line.
speed, yeah. But it's like it's to facilitate overtaking because of so much dirty air the F1 cars produce. It's very difficult to follow in corners, which makes like kind of basically the only way you can overtake in F1 for a long time would have been to outbrake someone into a corner that required braking. Overtaking the braking zone. The problem was you were going through corners, falling behind because of the turbulent air. You just couldn't stay close. Then you were getting onto a straight, and you were getting to the straight, and you were catching on the straight because of the slipstream, but you were never close enough to make a move. So the cycle would just continue, and people would just be following each other. The idea behind DRS is that the wing can open, giving you less drag and giving you a faster kind of acceleration and a higher top speed, which would allow you to catch up further to maybe be in a position where you could overtake at the end of the straight. And it's kind of a
Right.
controversial thing because it's an advantage to the person behind, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm kind of on board with that because it makes the racing closer, which
It
is
does.
a very good thing for spectators.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. It is quite effective at helping people overtake. There is something that occurs, which is because it only triggers if you're within 1 second of the car in front. Otherwise, everyone would just have their like flaps open all the time, apart from first place. Yeah, so sometimes if you have a line of cars all within 1 second of each other, they're all just giving each other DRS, so no one's gaining any advantage. So if the car at the
Right.
front of that line can't overtake like if the second car in line can't overtake the first one, nothing's going to happen because everyone's just going to be in a long line,
Yeah.
and that can be a problem. There was a Monaco GP recently where Fernando Alonso basically created the Alonso train because Monaco's a total nightmare to get an overtake done at. You pretty much overtake in the pits at Monaco. He just kind of drove really steadily, is maybe the way you'd put it, and just backed the entire pack behind him up. So there was like two separate races going on. There's like all the leaders, and there's just the Fernando train slowly rolling around the track.
That's quite funny.
Yeah, yeah. I think Fernando's the oldest racer in F1 at the moment. He's over 40, and he just doesn't give a fuck.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're not gonna at that point. You're like, well, I'm king of the castle. Fuck you all.
Yeah, yeah. He's won multiple world championships. Like, he's a quick guy who doesn't really need to prove anything anymore.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
So I mean, oh, sorry, that's what I was going to say. That, yeah, the new regulations are introducing I think they're introducing anyways, a new thing where on certain parts of the track, drivers will have access to like an additional deployable electric power. So like maybe, another like 50, 70 horsepower of electric power they can have access to on different parts of the track. I assume it's like they're saying it's not to replace DRS, so I assume it's something to like complement DRS.
Right.
And hopefully that'll facilitate better overtaking, because that's like, currently the F1 cars have like deployable energy, so they can like store energy through the kinetic recovery system and then deploy it through the battery at like times they need to do it, like when you're defending or attacking.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll be like an extra little bit of that. So, maybe if you're attacking or defending, you get like a little extra boost. Could be quite interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So,
So I don't know if I've convinced you to enjoy F1. Maybe there's some questions you have from a little
well,
history overview.
I have to say, from the brief history there, I think I'd enjoy the old races more. And to be honest, I'm not really sure why, because for me, really, from the history of it, the sort of early 2000s backwards is where I would be like, this actually sounds so fucking interesting and so enthralling as well. And
With the
just that,
excitement of innovation and speed.
yeah, like I want to be entertained when I'm watching. That's like the be all and end all as a spectator. And not only that, those eras you get to watch Senna, who's
Mm-hmm.
god tier, and you get to see Prost, you get to see Lauda, Hunt, you get to see all these legends racing. And admittedly, there's a little bit of living in the past, but the cars were cooler as well. And it's my view again, but I am of the persuasion that the more extreme something is, generally the better it is.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Um,
You want to ratchet up the extremeness.
yeah, especially when you're talking top flight. But I definitely do have a new appreciation for F1 off the back of that. And it's actually kind of flooring me a little bit just how much we have to thank Lotus for.
Yeah,
Like,
there's the thing with Lotus is they had like a couple of really dominant cars, but it's not like they were ever like an amazingly dominant team in F1. They had a lot of innovations that other teams picked up and then just became the thing that you did.
yeah, I mean, like when people talk about inventing stuff, I think the yardstick is Scotland, because like Scotland even invented the US Navy, for example, and the kind
Absolutely
of
no Scotland
parallel,
bias there, Colin.
no
No
Scotland
bias.
bias at all. But yeah, I mean, we did invent pretty much the modern world, and it seems that Lotus is the Scotland of Formula One. In a totally like serious manner. Like that's a statement. Like, and based on the amount of innovation that they brought to it, like that's like there's an argument for that being the case.
Honestly, in a lot of ways, Britain is kind of like responsible for a lot of innovation in F1. Because
Yeah, well, I
even
mean,
Mercedes, their F1 team's UK based.
well, yeah, 'cause it's made Mercedes McLaren, isn't it?
That's where it started, yeah. But now we've
Yeah.
got McLaren on the grid separately. The team structures are absolutely insane. I forgot to say, there's a team on the current grid. They've been in there for a while called Haas, and they're owned by Gene Haas, the American machining tools guy.
Right.
And basically, they were like always kind of like one of the lower budget teams, if you know what I mean, like a team that really struggled to raise money and stuff. But then they finally thought they'd hit the jackpot because they got a racer called Nikita Mazepin and he was a rookie, not very good, but most importantly, his dad was a Russian oligarch with
Oh,
like
okay.
billions behind him, and he basically wrote a check that just said, you don't have to worry about money anymore as long as my son is like your top boy, which was like all fine and dandy and great, even though he was crap. And they also had Mick Schumacher, who's Michael Schumacher's son, who was also not very good. And they both crashed a lot, and just it was a bad time. But then Russia obviously invaded Ukraine, and
The
the
money
FIA,
drive.
yeah, the FIA banned all of like Russian and Belarusian, or from like people from Russia and Belarus from like competing, which meant that suddenly Haas had to like ditch their very, very like wealthy Russian sponsor and his son, and then come up with another driver and all the money to replace that. And it was like it happened like right at the start of a season as well. I'm
Wow.
genuinely shocked that the Haas team are still a functioning team, and they're doing quite well this season, because like
Really?
that was a lot of money to lose, I would imagine.
Yeah. No, that's actually quite a nice story as well. The fact that they were like coasting along with shit drivers on this incredible amount of Russian money, and then it vanishes, but they end up doing well. That's actually quite a nice story.
Yeah, yeah. Haas have always been an interesting team because they're like a kind of they're like a customer of Ferrari, so they use a lot of Ferrari components and stuff, Ferrari engine and all that. But they've always kind of like when they first appeared, they kind of punched a bit above their weight, but then they had this period where they were like the last team, like them and Williams would be duking it out to see who could score the least points. But they've always every so often just had like one really really good performance out of nowhere, and I've always liked the Haas drivers. Like I could quite like Grosjean, and I quite like Magnussen, and I like Hulkenberg. They're like they pick at the moment they've kind of went back to pick like reliable drivers who are maybe never going to win a world championship, but are like fast, steady, safe. They don't make too many mistakes. Although Magnussen can be a bit of a wrecking ball when he wants to. He got a race ban this season because he racked up so many penalty points.
Really,
Yeah, it's not
that's
often someone gets a race ban.
I like that though. That sounds cool. Like, what did he do to get his penalties? Was he like,
He did quite a lot. I can't remember. I can't actually remember now. But what he did do helped his teammate score a point. So it was like pretty good for the team.
yeah? No, like it definitely has laden me with a brand new view of this. So it has.
Yeah, I
And
feel kind of conflicted about it though, because I've not always been that positive about the races themselves. But like maybe it's a little bit like when it's good, it's great, but then all the other times it's like a bit disappointing.
yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of got a new appreciation, but I think my view is similar to the one that I had before, and that was that I'm absolutely in love with the idea of early F1, but the new, and especially like the toning down of combustion power and going more electric. That puts me off in a massive, massive fashion.
Yeah, I was a little bit disappointed when I read that about the regs. I mean, it's definitely not Formula E, which I've never found particularly compelling.
No, I mean, you're essentially watching a washing machine run around a track at that point.
I genuinely think I'd rather watch them race golf buggies
Yeah,
around the
well, I
same
mean,
tracks and allow a little bit more contact than watching them race their Formula E's.
there's literally no difference between a Formula E car and a golf cart, though. It's like we've talked about this previously, like where it's like, oh, did you see the Rimac at
Oh, yeah, they do
Goodwood?
not
And it's
inspire me
like
at all.
it has 9 million horsepower and no soul. I would much rather go much slower in a Koenigsegg that has an absolute. Well, actually, I don't think you would go slower in a Koenigsegg. That's such a crap example. But like, I'd much rather go slower in a Lotus 7 and have it be an event and
I,
some magic around it. Like, they had such an opportunity there where they could have been like, we're going to push innovation. You're only allowed to use hydrogen gas this season as a fuel.
though that would be crazy.
Like they could have turned around and been like, you're not allowed to use a hydrocarbon fuel, and you're also not allowed to use batteries. Your fuels have to be synthetic, or you have to use hydrogen or some other alternative fuel source. Like they could have done so much to drive innovation. And do you know, if that came out, I would pretty much instantly have started watching Formula One. I don't think it would have mattered what else they did if they came out and that was in the news that Formula One's walking away from internal combustion, traditional fuels, and it's also not allowing any electric power. It now has to be alternate fuels that are not batteries. I would have full on bought a Sky package, bought an F1 TV package, and invested a fortune in watching it just to show support for a system that is not fucking batteries.
I'd also really like to see that, actually. I feel that it would take some real kind of driven change in F1 to see that. I think F1's become quite risk adverse. They really want the money. They want everything to kind of stay as profit. They want good fan numbers, they want good ticket sales, they want good sponsorship, they want good viewing numbers, you know. I feel that like that level of like innovative change, unless you gave the teams like a good like 5 years notice or maybe even more on some of that stuff, I think all the teams would just be like, well, we're just gonna pull out. And then as soon as you start losing like big names, if someone like Mercedes or Red Bull said, oh, we're pulling out of F1, like that's a huge change on the landscape of F1. To the point where actually they're adding a new team to F1. Cadillac are entering.
This was in the news the other day,
Yeah.
and I was actually quite excited about it.
That was another juicy bit of F1 goss, because basically F1 is just gossip. It's gossip with motorsport attached to it. That was the Michael Andretti, that's it. Michael Andretti, who is, he's the son of Mario Andretti, the earlier famous F1 driver, wanted to basically enter an F1 team, and he partnershiped with Cadillac to do it. It would be like the or Cadillac Andretti team, and the FIA were really, really reluctant to let him in. Like they just didn't want Andretti involved at all. They like kind of rejected his bid. Like, and it kind of like riled up the fan base a little bit. The fans are like, "Oh, we want an extra team. We want like more competition." You know, he's got like he had everything down on paper. You know, like he had the whole kind of package. Like he had the money, he had like the expertise, the familiarity of the sport, the connections, but he just wasn't. The FIA don't like him, and they reject the bid. And then Cadillac themselves like submitted it without Andretti's name attached, and it was accepted. You know, like that's the kind of pettiness that still exists in F1. It's quite snobby, actually. Like F1 started as a posho game, and you know, there's still quite a lot of that.
Yeah, it is. It does very much have the feeling of a boys' club. You know.
Yeah, yes. There's definitely
Um,
it's a small industry, and you know, bit of an old boys club.
um, I actually have a question for you. I'm very conscious of the runtime of this episode, and I really don't want to cut anything out of this as well because I have fucking thoroughly enjoyed every minute of this. But I have a question for you, and it is in your time researching this episode and then in putting the argument or the history of Formula One across to me, has it changed your view of the sport? And what's it
Not at
done to the
all.
way you view it?
Not at all. It's kind of solidified how I feel about F1, to be honest. I understand it. Like I see it for what it is. It's really flawed, but also it's really flawed because it's had this long, complicated, kind of meandering history. It's like, you know, when you try and track a problem back and then you quickly realize that this problem goes back so historically that it influences and is influenced by so many different factors that unpicking it is like it's like Christmas lights, you know, when you get them out and they're just like in this giant ball and you're
Yeah,
like, right, okay, well, I don't really want to do this, and you just have to slowly pick away at it and try and unravel it. I feel like that's what F1's like, and like I kind of see it for that. So like there's loads of stuff that I would change in F1, but also I don't it doesn't make me angry because like I kind of understand why the things are like the way they are. Like I get that it's a lot of it's money, which is kind of shit, but like also when you're running a sport that is like the top pinnacle motorsport, everything is going to cost a lot of money. It just is, you know? And like I talked about how I don't really like a lot of the pomp and circumstance. They have like the silliness around all of these events, like the kind of the sheer kind of over the top decadence of like, oh, it's the motor race, it's the Grand Prix coming to town, you know? But like I feel quite a lot of that's like a kind of pathetic nostalgia for like when it maybe actually did attract that kind of atmosphere.
yeah.
So yeah, like I feel a little bit sorry for F1 in in some ways. But no, I mean the bits that I love, like watching the racing on track, like seeing the battles, watching like the technical innovation, seeing kind of like the snide remarks that the manufacturers kind of like make to one another, like the different teams to kind of compete. One thing we didn't talk about, which is like its own thing, but it's more like a Sky problem, is that the commentating on F1 is absolutely fucking shocking in general. Like, honest to
Right.
God, just I mean the Sky team. Sometimes I'm not even sure they're watching the same race, you know, and sometimes the direction, like the way that the races are recorded, is absolutely shocking as well. Like you get loads and loads of shots of nothing happening, like loads of cars going in the straights, but you're watching a timing board and people are moving about. You're like, where the fuck's all the action going on? Not in our camera view, or too late to see what happened there.
Yeah, that sounds like a problem.
Yeah, that's not so good. Honestly, the camera work starts off in the earlier races. It's really not very good. Like the coverage of the action has improved dramatically over the years.
Yeah, that's hand in hand with more connectivity, I suppose, as well.
Totally, yeah. We've got drones now with like, crystal clear um capture.
Yeah, man. Well, I have to say, I have thoroughly enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, I
And
hope I hope you learned something about F1 at least, you know.
oh, definitely. Sometimes I feel a bit funny about subjects like this because without tooting my own horn, I do know an incredible amount about automotive engineering. And it sometimes feels like there's not a lot left to discover, if that makes sense. And
Yeah, I can understand. Yeah.
it's a falsehood because the man who knows everything is a liar. And this is one of the most enjoyable parts of this was going through the history of Formula One. And I was like, holy fuck, that's incredible. And like, it's
Completely. It was a
really,
whistle stop tour of Formula One as well. There is really there's so much information. There's so much stuff happens. You know, so many years and so many races each year.
yeah. And like, the thing is though, it really has opened my eyes that there's still so much more out there to experience and everything else. But I have to say, I think it's fortified the way I feel about it, and that is that I think the older stuff is the best. And I think that's pretty much my thought.
You know
But
what? I'll take that. I completely understand why you gravitate more towards the old stuff. And as just a little warning caveat, that's where I started, and I just got into it. And then I was like, okay, I've watched quite a lot of the old stuff. What's going on now? And then it had me fucking hooked.
fair enough, man. Well, I will promptly ignore your warning and start watching the old stuff again
I
because
think there's a lot of it on YouTube too.
I actually have an appetite to go and watch it as well off the back of this, and I have found it genuinely interesting. So no, thank you very much.
That's no problem. Do you want to hear one last story that's a little dark just before we
Go for
wrap
it,
up?
man. Hit me with
Which,
the last one.
which is one of the people who died as a driver in F1. They were killed by, I think it was a fire extinguisher that hit them on the head as they were going past. So I think what happened was there was a crash back in, like a lot, early F1, not super early F1, but like, like still safety was not a priority. And
Yeah,
one of the marshals was trying to cross a live track to put out a fire with a fire extinguisher, and he got hit by a car. And then I think the fire extinguisher then hit the driver behind that and killed him instantly because he was traveling so fast.
fucking hell.
Yeah, like honestly, the early F1 safety was not even considered. It was like they willfully disregarded it.
Yeah, that's gnarly. So it is. That is actually a little bit crazy.
Yeah, it was caught on film as well.
Poor guy.
Yeah, I know, crazy. Anyway, sorry. So yeah, that's been
Oh,
a very brief whistle stop tour of the history of F1, covering some stuff but not very much. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and I genuinely do hope you enjoy the classic F1 races because they are really really good.
yeah, I'm gonna have to give them a watch, man. There's just no excuse for it not after this.
Honestly, just
Oh,
you've got a TV in your garage, yeah?
no, not
You might
yet.
need to get a computer, TV, laptop, something in the garage that you can have it on while you're working on the car.
That actually sounds really good.
Bit of background noise, get some classic Murray Walker commentating in there. That could actually be that's like a nice little atmosphere.
Definitely. That sounds like a plan for the garage future. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the case for Formula One.
Would you
And
say we got to the finishing line?
I would say we got to the finishing line, man.
That's such a
Yeah,
terrible pun,
that
sorry.
was such a pun, but I love it. It was good. Yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed this, and hopefully the listeners have enjoyed this as well. Now, if you would be so kind, listeners, give us a like, a share, and a subscribe, and leave us a review. As always, 5 stars or nothing. Thank you very much. And also, if you could let us know your thoughts on this episode, because this could be the start of a little histories of motorsport mini series to go along with some of the other ones that we're doing in the background that you don't know about yet. So, as always, thank you for listening.
Of course, feel free to be correcting me as much as possible in the comments. I want to
Yeah.
know I want to know everything that I got wrong and why I'm a bad person because of it.